So I just thought I start with bowing to the female practitioners which have gone before us. You can join or you can't. Just bowing. So today I want to talk about the early Buddhist women, these early heroines who gained enlightenment. And we know about them through a book called The Therigatha's. I've got one version here by Susan Murcott, which is really lovely. So this is sort of like early Buddhist scriptures as part of the Pali Canon. And it talks about 73 of the women. There are 73 poems, 73 songs of awakening by the Teris. Teris, it's the name for the elders, for the wise women, for the women who have gained enlightenment. And these women, they come from all different kinds of backgrounds, different ages, social backgrounds. Some of them have been servants, there's a queen in there as well. There are courtesans, there are prostitutes, there are mothers, there are wives, there are truth seekers from all kinds of backgrounds. And they all were disciples of the Buddha. And I'm not going to say anything about the Buddha because you probably all know about the Buddha. He was a guy called Siddhartha Gautama 2,500 years ago who gained a state of being called enlightenment. He awakened to the truth. And he gathered people around him, and some of them were also women. And the Buddha's view towards women at the time was quite remarkable. The view at the time, the Brahminical view, the Hindu view, was that women should do nothing independently, even in their own house. So, in childhood, they were subject to their father. In youth, they were subject to their husband. And when their husband died, they were subject to their sons. They should never enjoy independence, and women were just expected to be wives and mothers. And if there was nobody else to be dependent upon, they became outsiders of society. If there was nobody to look after them. And that was very dangerous at the time, very unsafe life. Often they were seen like prostitutes, if there was nobody around. Maybe in our culture a few hundred years ago, it was the same for women who had nobody else around. And at the time of the Buddha, there was sort of like a very few women who became wanderers, seekers for the truth, who would be sort of like trying to find truth. It was a time of quite a lot of prosperity when the Buddha lived, and there were a lot of men trying to seek the truth, as the Buddha was one of them. But there were also a few truth seekers on the woman's side. So right at the beginning, the people who went into homelessness, who left their home to follow the Buddha, they were men. But through the help of a woman called Mahaprajapati, and I'm going to tell you about her in a moment, and a great guy called Ananda, after some time, also women were allowed to go forth from home into homelessness. But they needed the consent of the men. So they needed the consent of their father or of their husbands or of their sons to actually do that step. Vishvapani, somebody who wrote a great book about the Buddha, he said that Gautama, this is the name of the Buddha beforehand, was certain that women could gain realization. And he may have been the first teacher ever to regard women as spiritual equals in this respect. So before that, there was this view, women can't do that. But, the Buddha believed in that. So this Sangha of the nuns was a radical experiment for the time. And very early on, these women, like the men, there were no monasteries, there were no sort of like anything planned. They were sort of like asked, just go out into the woods, practice, sit under a tree, reflect, meditate. And these women, they also went alone into the forest. It was a very dangerous thing, not only because of wild animals, because, as I said, they were outsiders of society, outsiders of the protection of men, and there were dangers, like being raped or something. They were sometimes called the shaven-headed horse and treated as sexually available. So one of these women, very early on, is Shuba. Shuba means bright, shining, beautiful. So I think she was quite a beautiful woman. And instead of marrying, she actually became a shamani, a female wanderer, sort of like somebody who went out into the woods. And she really liked going into the woods alone, dwelling at the foot of a tree, meditating and reflecting. So one day, Shuba was actually walking into this really lovely woods called the Jivakamba. In Buddhist scriptures, it's always sort of like a name of a place, and some of them are really beautiful. So she went out into these woods, and this guy came and stopped her. He's called a rookman, a villain. So Shuba said to him, "What wrong have I done? Why are you standing in my way? It is not right to touch a woman who has gone forth." Yeah, so he's just sort of like stopping her. And she says, "I live without blemish in purity. So why do you block me?" So this is part of the Therigatha. It's one of these texts. "Your mind is out of control, full of passion, but I am serene. My passion is gone. I'm clear and my mind is free in every way. So why do you block me?" So instead of running away, or sort of like fighting, she's just standing there and says, "Why do you block me?" And he just goes, "You are young and innocent. What will leaving home do for you? Throw away your saffron robes, come enjoy the flowering woods. Sweetness falls from the trees, flower pollen whirls all around. The beginning of spring is a time of joy. Come, enjoy the flowering woods. What pleasures will you have if you go alone in the woods? You want to go without a companion into the lonely, huge, frightening forest. Where savage animals live. Come, live in a house with me in the calm of a palace. Let women serve you. I will dress you in gold, pearls, and precious stones. Climb onto a bed of fragrant sandalwoods." So he's really trying to, get her away from his path. And she just says, "This fragile body is full of death and headed for the grave. What do you see of value here that makes you stare at me? You are out of your mind." And then he says, "Your eyes, like those of a doe," I think that's a female deer, yeah, "they excite me. They are like the bud of a blue lotus, pure shining, your long eyelashes, your pure gaze. No eyes are dearer to me than yours." And he just goes on and on and on. And she says to him, "You are heading down the wrong path. You want the moon as your toy, but you are chasing the Buddha's child. There is nothing in heaven and earth that I want. I don't even know about desire. What is it? It is like a bowl of poison to me. Try to seduce someone who hasn't seen this and hasn't sat at the teacher's feet. But if you try this one, you will end up frustrated. My attention is unshaken by joy or pain, praise or blame. I know there is no happiness in anything born from a cause, and I cling to nothing. Blind man, you are chasing an empty thing and illusion." And we do this sometimes as well, yeah? "A tree of gold at the end of a dream, a puppet show in a crowd. An eye is just a little ball in a socket with a bubble in the middle, tears secretion." And then Juba plucked out her eye and said, "Here, take the eye, and she gave it to him. And you can imagine what happened. His passion died that moment. And then he begged her for forgiveness. And he said, make yourself whole again, religious woman. This won't happen again. Coming up against you is like embracing fire or grabbing a poisonous snake. Make yourself whole again, forgive me. And then he let her go. And she went on to the Buddha, and seeing him, her eye was restored. I mean, that's the story, what it says in there. So this has been Shuba. So Shuba encountered something hostile, and she did not run away. She did not fight. She acted totally different, yeah. She met him with calmness and fearlessness. And his hostility, his greed got nothing to feed on. So what a shock for him when she passed on her eye. He said, like, it's like coming up against you, like embracing a fire. Because she must have been quite a person, I imagine, yeah. One even can feel a bit sorry for him. But she is sort of like, she had this quality of unshakability. I imagine she was just standing there, yeah, in a state of mind, totally unshakable. Nothing can stand in her way, and she totally destroyed his false illusions. So for us sometimes, we might sort of like also be going for something, maybe a person, just projecting onto that being, and then, something happens and we realize this was all just an illusion. So I think this is what happened to the guy. But at the time, after a while, she must have been one of the very first women to do this step. It was actually not allowed for women to wander alone anymore. The rules were changed. So they had to go at least in twos, which was a bit safer. So they would wander from village to village, like the monks, and they go from house to house, and they've got this begging bowl and asking for alms. And they accept anything which was given to them. And later on, even, they lived in kind of monasteries, but they were very simple. So they had no belongings except for a robe, the one they were wearing, a begging bowl, a water and a filter, a needle and a thread, and the women had a hip string for their menstruation. So these were the only things which were allowed for them to take. But even having so little and living this simple life, so many talked about the freedom they experienced. In the Charigatas, you hear their cries of victory. Probably there's the Charagata, it's the poems of the monks. It's probably very similar, but here you hear their cries of victory. In the text, there is very little teaching on the Dharma, on the Buddha's teaching, but they all have this spirit of, I've done it, I plucked out craving, roots and all. I have removed fear from my heart. The massive darkness is torn aside, so there is this sense. And they all had their reasons to go forth into the homeless life, yeah. For some of them, it was a lot of pain, yeah. The pain was so big, there was no other way. Otherwise, they would have gone mad or killed themselves. But this was sort of like a way to look at the first noble truth, that there is pain and a path away from the suffering. So they were disillusioned with life, which sometimes is not a bad start, yeah, to go forth. So some of them, they were longing, they might have met the Buddha and heard him and touched something in them where they could see, there is their potential, they can grow. And others were on a real search for truth. Probably the reasons for them are a bit similar to us here. We all have reasons to be here and to go forth or to find out about Buddhism. And Vishwapani, who I mentioned before, quotes a woman called Catherine Blackstone, who studied the verses of the nuns. And I found that really interesting. So this woman, concludes that the nuns had a distinctive approach to Dharma practice, while the monks' verses value peacefulness and quietude. The women's path to enlightenment was fraught with difficulties that must be faced. And while the monks stress detachment, the women's lives after awakening show a transformation of their emotional response to others. For one thing, they no longer needed men. When Mara appeared before one of the Terries, Mara is sort of like a mythical figure who stands in the way of our development, and he is fantastic with doubt, or holding you back. So he still appears these days. I know him quite well. And then she declared that men are in the past for me. I do not grieve, I do not weep, and sir, I'm not afraid of you. Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting, that the woman's past is full of difficulties that must be faced. This keeps on. Yeah. And it's probably to do with being a mother. At the time they were sort of like, most of them, they were mothers and had kids. And yeah, if something really strong happened, as you will hear in one of the stories, yeah, so they had to work through these difficulties and a transformation of the emotional response to others. So, how did this order of the nuns come into the being? And it all starts with Prajapati. So, at her birth, an astrologer foretold that she will be a leader of a large following. So, she was also the daughter of a king. Um, and her name actually means the leader of a great assembly. And later on, she even became the title Maha Prajapati. And a lot of people might actually know her, Maha Prajapati, because she became the foster mother of the Buddha. So the Buddha's mother, Maya, actually died after a few days after he had been born. And his mum's sister, Prajapati, stepped in and raised the Buddha. So she became the second wife of King Suddhodana, the father of Siddhartha, and she breastfed Siddhartha and brought him up like her own son. But after Siddhartha had left the palace, he left everybody to go in the quest of finding a way away from suffering. It wasn't such an easy time because the king, he was really disappointed. He was hurt and angry. So his future king who was all his hope, had just left the palace. And for several years, they didn't hear anything about what happened to Siddhartha. But then rumors reached the palace and miraculous stories, and they said that he had become a Buddha, an awakened one. So Prajapati took the first opportunity to see her stepson when he was coming back to the city. So she left the palace to see Siddhartha, at least from the back of the crowd. And when she saw and heard what he said, that really changed her life. She realized she had heard the truth. She reflected on what she heard and started meditating. And she talked with her own son, half-brother of the Siddhartha, about what she had heard. He was called Nanda. But then one day, Nanda was gone. He had followed the Buddha, became a renunciate and become a monk. And Mahaprajapati, in some ways, she could understand that he had taken the step, but it was hard for her. And over the next year, Nanda wasn't the only one. There were actually a lot of people, especially around the house, about the clan of the Shakyans, who went forth, who followed the Buddha, who became monks, and they left, they left what they were expected to do, and these women were left behind. Yeah. So these women appeared at court and asked if they could stay. There were all quite a lot of them family members, and stay with Prajapati and King Suddhodana. But then the king died, and the place became a place of refuge for the women. So first it was just the relatives, but then also, some peasant woman or some merchant woman, they all came there. Um, there was also a war, which meant that a lot of the women lost their husbands. So the palace was filled with the women. In Buddhist scriptures, if it's a lot, it always says 500 of them. So they were looking for protection, advice, and support from Mahaprajapati, and they were looking for answers. How shall our lives continue without the identity and security of a man? So, Susan Murcutt again. Um, So others came to resolve ultimate questions of birth, suffering, and death. Yet others sought a new family with women they trusted and with whom they shared common experience. The longing of these women, whatever form it took, became their spiritual aspirations. All had personal stories, most of which are now lost, and a particular experience of what the Buddha called the first noble truth. So there is suffering. This is what motivated them to join with Prajapati in the new and radical way she was about to suggest. Prajapati recognized the powerful conjunction of events and people. An old and influential woman without further worldly obligations, she was surrounded by displaced wives, widows, consorts, dancers, and musicians. Lacking other kin, these women were turning to her and to one another. Having fully grasped the situation, Prajapati decided to take the following course, recounted in the Kula Vagga. It's a Buddhist text. So I'm going to read you this text. And there is sort of like in these Buddhist texts, because in the early days they were just orally transmitted. Sometimes there are repetitions which sound a bit weird for us. The occasion was this. The Buddha, the Blessed One, was living among the Shakyans in Nigroda's park at Kapilavastu. Mahaprajapati Gautami, so his stepmother, went to him. She paid homage and stood at one side. Then she said, Lord, it would be good if women could obtain the going forth from the house life into homelessness in the Dhamma and discipline declared by the Perfect One. Enough, Gautami. Do not ask for the going forth from the house life into homelessness for women in the Dharma and discipline declared by the Perfect One. So he said no. She asked a second and a third time and was refused. Then she thought, the Blessed One does not allow it, and she was sad and unhappy. She paid homage to the Blessed One and departed, keeping him on her right. Now, when the Blessed One had stayed at Kapilavastu as long as he chose, he set out to wander by stages to Vaishali. When he eventually arrived there, he went to live in the hall with the pointed roof of the great wood. Lovely, these descriptions. Meanwhile, Mahaprajapati Gautami had her hair cut off and put on the yellow robe. With a number of Shakyan women, she set out to Vaishali. On arrival there, she went to the hall with the pointed roof in the great wood, and she stood there outside the porch. Her feet were swollen, her limbs covered with dust, and she was sad and unhappy, with tears on her face and sobbing. As she stood thus, the venerable Ananda saw her. So Ananda has been the cousin of the Buddha, and he became his attendant and his friend, and everybody loves Ananda. Gautami, why are you standing outside the porch like this? Lord Ananda, it is because the Blessed One does not allow the going forth for women in the Dhamma and discipline declared by the Perfect One. Then Gautami, wait here till I ask the Blessed One about this. So he's stepping in, The Venerable Ananda went to the Blessed One and told him what had happened, and he said, Lord, it would be good if women might obtain the going forth from the house life into homelessness in the Dhamma and discipline declared by the Perfect One. Enough, Ananda. Do not ask for the going forth from the house life into homelessness for women in the Dharma and discipline declared by the Perfect One. So he got a no as well. He asked a second and a third time and was refused. Then he thought, the Blessed One does not allow it, but suppose I ask the Blessed One in another way. Then he said, Lord, are women capable, after going forth from the house life into homelessness in the Dharma and discipline declared by the Perfect One, of realizing the fruit of stream entry or one's return or non-return or arahantship? So this is a declaration of sort of like irreversible stages of attainment you can gain up to enlightenment. So he was clever, wasn't he? He's asked, so what's the principle behind it, you know? Can they actually gain enlightenment? They are Ananda, the Buddha said. If that is so, Lord, then since Mahaprajapati Gautami has been exceedingly helpful to the Blessed One, when as his mother's sister she was his nurse, his foster mother, his giver of milk, she suckled the Blessed One when his own mother died. Since that is so, Lord, it would be good if women could obtain the going forth. Ananda, if Mahaprajapati Gautami accepts 8 capital points, that will count as her full admission. So this was the start of the women being ordained. So, why do you think the Buddha did not want to allow the women to form an order of the nuns? I mean, we don't know it, so you can just come up with any ideas.
Maybe she thought it was too dangerous for them, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never understood it because I thought, oh, the guy's enlightened. He would give up and throw it away. I would say, yeah, what's the problem?
Yeah.
Must have been something to do with karuna.
Yeah.
Distractions for male monastics.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe he hadn't spent much time with women. Maybe he didn't know them very well.
Could also be, yeah. So he didn't see the point.
No, he didn't really. He hadn't spent time with them.
Yeah.
Or maybe because it would have been hard to make the Buddhist ideas like spread, because people might not accept that women were also practicing it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, some people might just refuse to practice Buddhism because this was not like normal back then.
Yeah. It's also.
Like you started talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Patriarchal norms and cultures in society inadvertently gets translated into belief systems as well. People don't realize it's happening, so it just becomes part of the fabric, so it's just something that's sort of accepted, although it's not necessarily true, but that's just the way it comes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Independent women are often seen as a threat. So, and if they don't go into this web of independence, of domination, then so the whole system would change.
Yeah.
That's threatening. It's not the women themselves necessarily, but the whole system would change.
Yes, they are mothers. I mean, if they would leave their families and go forth like the guys, who's going to look after the children? Who's even going to have children? Yeah. So it probably was a mixture of all of that. I remember on another retreat, I gave a similar talk. And one of the guys, I thought that was quite interesting. He said maybe the Buddha had to say no so that the women were actually stepping up, sort of like that they weren't stopped by the first no, which is quite interesting because it was such a big step. It had such a big effect on society. Maybe he wanted to see the determination. Yeah, so we don't know. We don't know. There is no, as far as I can see, there was no explanation. What?
To teach them to be less obedient is enlightenment. To teach them to break the obedience that they were accustomed to.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, there was a question I thought, are there, in our own lives, are there sort of like traditions or conventions which really stop us from going forth, which stop us from taking a next step? That could be quite interesting just to look at, am I part of ideas which really stopped me from taking a next step.
Yes, it's really nice because you think if he has said yes in the first time, it would have been a man that says, okay, you can do that. And you need the blessing for a man to be independent, to have independence too. Or you're subjected to a man for this decision. If as they step forward,
Yeah.
then it's somehow independent. It gives power to the woman.
Say it again. Yes. 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 So I don't know if Mahaprajapati could have come to the point herself, but it definitely helped that Ananda came from a totally different angle and not sort of like being on the level of the customs of the days, or of sort of like asking if the women can actually join the order. But he was coming from a much higher level, wasn't he? Asking, can they actually gain enlightenment? And um, and and the Buddha said, yes, they can. Ben. Yeah. Yeah, so they had 8 extra rules, and in some ways, which is still up today in the monastic order, they are subject to the, let me just say, they put the women under the authority of men. So these were the rules. So it's still like, it could be a really old nun, somebody who has practiced for 20, 30 years. And in the monastery, she has to sit behind the youngest ordained monk. So this is still part of what's happening in the monastic order in Buddhism today. But at the time, Mahaprajapati, she thought, that's what I'm used to anyway, and she accepted the rules immediately, not only for herself, but for all the other women. Later on, she actually tried to change it, but she wasn't lucky. Yeah. So it is quite a patriarchal society in Buddhism. And it's interesting that not a lot of people know about these women, these early practitioners. When I was on retreat with Artiketu, he actually said you didn't know any of the stories. A couple of them, yeah, or not many. So it's good to tell them. Yeah. So Mahaprajapati, she became the first bhikkhuni, the first nun, who wholeheartedly practiced the Dharma. And later on, she also gained enlightenment. But she was sort of like really important for all the other women. She looked after them, she taught them the Dharma. And it is said that she became 120 years old, whatever that means. And I was talking about in the Therigathas, they all have poems, and this is her poem. Homage to you, Buddha, best of all creatures, who set me and many others free from pain. All pain is understood, the cause. The craving is dried up, the noble eightfold path unfolds. I have reached the state where everything stops. I have been mother, son, father, brother, grandmother. Knowing nothing of the truth, I journeyed on. So she's just been one life after the other. And she, as she said, she's been a mother, a brother, a grandmother, a father, reborn into different ways. But I have seen the Blessed One. This is my last body, and I will not go from birth to birth again. So this is sort of like the Buddhist idea that when we gain enlightenment, we won't be reborn again. So I love Mahaprajapati for her determination and her courage to stand up for her convictions, her longings, her values against all odds, against the conventions. So thank you, Mahaprajapati. So the next woman I'm going to tell you about is Patachara, and this is a real tragedy. So this is a warning. In the Therigathas, a lot of women talk about how their families have been destroyed through death, through wars, through disasters. And 1/3 of these women with children lost their children. They became outcasts or lived in terrible circumstances. And as I said before, there were not many choices for women outside family life. So Padachara's story starts well. Yeah, she is from Savatthi and comes from a banker's family. She's well off, and it's all set up that she is going to marry well. But then she falls in love with one of the servants, and they run off together to a very far away village. She breaks with her family, and they stay there. But one day she becomes pregnant, and it was, as it was part of the tradition at the time, the women want to go home to their parents' place, yeah, to deliver the baby there, probably just to be much better supported. But the husband, probably really scared, he doesn't want her to go. He doesn't want to go back there because he might be imprisoned, he might be killed, he doesn't know. So he says to her, no, you can't go. You can't go without me. You can't go in this place. So she just runs away to Savatthi. And halfway to Savatthi, her husband catches up with her and trying to convince her to go back to the village. But she insists that she wants to go to her parents' place. So suddenly she has her birth pains and she gives birth to a baby son. And then they go back home. But soon she is pregnant again. And she requests again to follow her parents. And he does the same again. Her husband, he refuses. And then she just runs away again. So she has been pregnant and she has the toddler with her. And halfway to Savatthi, I don't know why she doesn't go earlier, but halfway to Savatthi, she's caught up by her husband again. But this time, a terrible storm just appears, yeah? It's quite out of season with thunder and lightning, and it just rains down in buckets. I don't know if you've been to India before, but sometimes these seasonal rains, they are just amazing. And just then her birth pain starts again. So she asks her husband to find them a shelter, and he just goes off to build a really rough hut from branches. But then he gets hidden by a poisonous snakes, and within minutes, he is dead, falling on the floor. So Patachara doesn't know what has happened to him, and she just gives birth on her own to her second child. And through the night, while the rain is just thundering and lightning, and the rain is just coming down, she just protects her newborn baby and the child with her body. The next morning, she is totally exhausted and she went looking for her husband. And not far away, she finds him there lying dead, his body already being stiff. And she was overtaken by grief and also by guilt. But then she decides to go to her parents' place anyway. So after some time, she comes to this river, which she has to cross. And the river has really risen up, so she can't walk through there with both kids. It's just too much. She is exhausted. So what she does, she puts the older boy next to the bank, and she just walks through the river with the baby. And on the other sides, she just puts him safely on a piece of moss. And then she returns to take the other boy. Midstream, this is horrible, yeah? A hawk in search of prey sees the baby and he thinks it's just some piece of meat, and he just swoops down and just takes the baby with him. And Patachara is right in the middle of the river. She can't do anything, totally helpless, and she just screams, but the hawk does not let go of the baby. And the older boy hears his mum screaming, doesn't know what's happening, so he just toddles down to the river, gets into the water, and is immediately swept away by the turbulent current. So it's nothing she can do. She's just in the middle of the river. She can't do anything. She can't save any of them. So This is a triple tragedy, you know. She is just wailing and lamenting, 3 tragedies in one day. So not enough. I don't know why they have this story in here, but it seems to be everything is coming together. So she decides in the end to go towards Savati. She's half crazed, half mad, full of guilt and pain. And reaching Savati, she meets one of the neighbors and asks him about her parents. And he says, "Please don't ask me. Last night, during the storm and rain, their house collapsed, burying the old couple and their son. They were cremated today. You can still see the smoke from the funeral pyre over there." And when she saw the smoke, she went mad. Her whole world had gone off in smoke. She tore off her clothing and ran around naked, forgot who she was, weeping and wailing. She slept on rubbish heaps and after a while stopped talking. People got out of her way as soon as they saw her. "There's the mad, naked woman," they would say. So one day the Buddha comes into the area and lots of people go to actually see him, and they drag Patachara along with them. So some people at the meeting place, they try to stop her from entering. But the Buddha saw Patachara at the entrance to the monastery. He recognized her as one who was ripe for his message of deliverance. The lay disciples cried out, "Don't let that crazy woman come here." But the Buddha said, "Do not hinder her. Let her come to me." And when she had drawn near, he told her, "Sister, regain your mindfulness." Instantly, she regained her mindfulness. A kindly man threw her his outer cloak. She put it on, and approaching the enlightened one, she prostrated herself at his feet and told him her tragic story. The Buddha listened to her patiently, with deep compassion, and then replied, "Patachara, do not be troubled anymore. You have come to one who is able to be your shelter and refuge. It is not only today that you have met with calamity and disaster, but throughout this beginningless round of existence, weeping over the loss of sons and others dear to you, you have shed more tears than the waters of the 4 oceans." As he went on speaking about the perils of samsara, her grief subsided. The Buddha then concluded his instructions with the following verse: "The 4 oceans contain but a little water compared to all the tears that we have shed, smitten by sorrow, bewildered by pain. Why, O woman, are you still heedless?" So these simple words, they really touched me. "Sister, regain your mindfulness." And I wondered how he said that. You know, did he say it sort of like, "Sister, regain your mindfulness"? I don't think so. He probably said it with a lot of compassion. "Sister, regain your mindfulness." And I remembered a story from my own life. I was not ordained yet. I was a Buddhist, and one of my first teachers, Navachita, who I had got to know in New Zealand, she was actually living in Wales. And I was traveling with a friend around Wales. And the 2 of us, we were in a car, quite different personalities. We got in a lot of trouble with each other. You know, I think we were at a stage where we could hardly talk to each other. So I was going to come to see Navachita. She was in a cafe waiting for me. And Ulrike, this friend, she just went off in a different way. So I came into the cafe and just immediately told Navachita all the horrible things Ulrike had done. It was just like, brr, brr, brr. And then Navachita said to me, she just really like nearly went, stopped me, and she said, "Just be kind, Sabine, be kind." And there was such a force and strength the way she said this. And I immediately, maybe you know this feeling of when you feel a lot of shame and it just comes up here. And I knew that she knew that I could do so much better. Yeah, so it was just be kind, Sabina, be kind. And it was a bit like these words of the Buddha, sister, regain your mindfulness. And the Buddha also told her, that suffering has happened, like she has wept over so many beings before, like the water of the four rivers. And the teaching of the Buddha penetrated her mind so deeply that she completely grasped the impermanence of all conditioned things and the universality of suffering. By the time the Buddha had finished his teaching, she was not a lamenting madwoman anymore, but a stream entrant, a knower of the truth, one assured of final liberation. So immediately Patachara requested to go for refuge and ordination, and the Buddha sent her to the other bhikkhunis. She practiced with great diligence, and one day she must have been somebody who sort of like really had a lot of diligence and really tried hard. And she reflected on all her efforts, her diligence. And then she wondered, why have I not attained enlightenment yet? But then, this is the verse, having washed my feet, I reflected upon the waters. When I saw the foot water flow from the high ground down the slope, my mind became concentrated, like an excellent thoroughbred steed. Having taken a lamp, I entered my cell. I inspected the bed and sat down on the couch. Then, having taken a needle, I pulled down the wick of the lamp. The liberation of my mind was like the quenching of a lamp. So as she observed the water trickling down the slope, she noticed that some streams from her washing water for the feet, they sank quickly into the ground. Others flowed down a little further, and others flowed all the way down to the bottom of the slope. And she recognized this was a perfect image for life. So some beings live for a short time like her children, some into their adult years as her husband, and some others to old age like her parents. But just as all the streams of water had to eventually disappear into the soil, so Death, the end maker, lays his hands upon all living beings, and none can escape him. When this realization dawned upon Patachara, her mind immediately became composed. With steady concentration, she contemplated conditioned phenomena as impermanent and that there is suffering and no self. But still, in spite of her efforts, she could not make the breakthrough to final liberation. Fatigued, she decided to retire for the night. When she entered her hut, she sat down on the bed. Just as she extinguished the oil lamp, the momentum she had built up through her previous practice bore fruit. In a fraction of a second, simultaneously with the quenching of the lamp, supreme knowledge arose. She had reached her goal, nibbana, the permanent quenching of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusions. So, this is the end of the three stories. Thank you. So Max wanted to say something.